Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com. Ozcast.
Welcome to Strategicon.
Hello world, I'm John Bruni and you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. The likely trajectory of the Ukraine war and the fair world order that is emerging, that is going to be the topic for today's discussion. And today, to address this topic, we are joined by returning guest Rhoderick Miller from the UK. We're also joined by co-host David Olney and Michael Migali. I need my hand so I can do that Brady Bunch thing. There we go. Anyway, so where are we, Rhoderick, in terms of the whole Ukraine war? I suspect that the Russians are still pushing it very hard to try to get Severodonetsk and one of the other towns beginning with L, but I am nowhere near able to pronounce it. But these two, that's it. So basically, these two towns are central to Russia's effort in securing the Donetsk-Luhansk area. Do you think that the Russians have the capacity to move further toward the Dnieper River?
Militarily, the Russians won this ages ago. It's, as I said, the first time we had this, they are destroying the Ukrainian army in detail. Everything that's in their way is going to be destroyed. To be honest, I am a couple days out of sync, but I thought they had already taken at least one of those. And the other one, as I said, a couple days out of sync. I haven't been following the last 2 days. The Russians will take them. You can go online and you can see the way they are fighting. They are low casualties, high infliction rate, very, very systematic. There's nothing going to stop them take these towns. Then they march on, I think the geopolitics means they've got to go to Lviv.
They're going to go to Lviv. Well, the best available evidence that we understand, and, there are limits to what we can actually know about this war because, war is the first casualty is truth, as we know. But, there is this thing called a culmination point. And we have discussed this once before with you. Some senior American, retired perhaps, but senior American people have been suggesting that the Russian forces are close to culmination. One U.S. Army retired General Ben Hodges suggests that the Russians have up until August to prosecute their war and secure the Donbass region, beyond which, following up any major military effort, pushing beyond the Dnieper River, or perhaps even doing a feint into Lithuania or trying to take on Finland, will be way beyond what the Russian conventional military force is able to do. What are your thoughts? The
generals who say that are either fools or liars.
Ooh, that's a big call.
The brutal reality is the Russians have never, in this entire episode, been struggling.
Now, where do you get that? But let me ask you this one question, because I enjoy getting the contrary view, but I must ask, for sake of clarity, where are you getting this information from for our audience? Because they will listen to this. They're probably getting a lot of their stuff from the Western media. They'll listen to you and they'll say, "Wow, that Rhoderick, he's a Russian." And I'd like to know where you're getting this sort of information from, because it will.
There are no shortage of Russian sources around. there are also no shortage of people deeply critical of the Russians. If you want really good first-hand information, you need to go onto Telegram, and you will get first-hand information from the field, from the Ukrainians, from the Russians. Now, you have to filter it, but it's very hard to filter the actual footage. Every now and again, you will get a reasonably good Western report about it. Invariably, it's about 2-3 weeks out of date. The French military occasionally produced, at the beginning, the French military produced really good stuff, and then they sort of fizzled. It's also worth keeping in mind, you need to keep in mind who are actually lying, who have a reputation for lying all the time. So the British MOD, the Ukrainian, any part of the Ukrainian army, who has a reputation for not lying? The Russian Defense Department, they...
Pardon?
I'm not
Yeah,
saying this.
sorry.
Delusional man.
Wow, hang on, let's unpack that.
So, as a general point of view, this is Putin's perspective. It's been his perspective for ages, is don't lie. Because you get caught, right? If you don't want somebody to know anything, you don't tell them the thing, right? When you watch his interviews, he gets asked a question, he'll usually answer 4 or 5 statements. Statement number 1 is undeniably true. Statement number 2 is undeniably true if you accept his perspective. Statement number 3 will be a rhetorical one. Statement number 4 will be his perspective. Sometimes statement number 4 is replaced by a question. That's usually when he's trying to hide something or attack. Watch the way the man talks. He's been very strict with his immediate cohorts, very strict with the most important departments. Don't lie.
See,
there's plenty of things they don't say. That's a different matter. And there's plenty of occasions when they're wrong. But they're far more fastidious about the truth than we are. We lie constantly.
No.
Look, I'm a cynic, and I can understand that there is a degree, to greater or lesser impact of propaganda that's out there, because, of course, we have chosen sides, and we in the West are backing the Ukrainians over the Russians. But having said that, you are talking about a totalitarian state. And the one thing that I do know is that totalitarian states are usually quite judicious with the truth.
More importantly, Putin's transition.
Totalitarian. Putin is authoritarian.
Rhoderick, be quiet for a sec.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I didn't hear you, John. That's why I was talking over you. Sorry.
No, but just, again, you're saying where you're getting your source from. I want to give listeners an alternate source to understand how Putin has changed in how he communicates. So there was a brilliant young Russian-English journalist called Peter Pomerantsev who went to Russia in the early 2000s and basically was there from the transition from Russian trying to be modern and trying to speak truth, and Putin trying to put his PhD into practice and create an economically functional state. And he lists the moment where it all went horribly wrong and Putin flicked the gear back to being a KGB colonel, as when that theatre in St. Petersburg, the terrorists took the hostages and Russian special forces filled it with gas and killed everyone. And he said that was the moment where Putin changed gear, because until then, he believed there was value in truth. After that, he believed there was a value in controlling the story. And you control the story with a combination of truth and outright lies, because that way no one can ever tell what's true and what's not. By the time Pomerantsev had to leave Russia, he had documented this transition so well that when he released his book, every time Pomerantsev tried to do a live broadcast for his first book, it would suddenly get crashed.
Yeah, well, I have no doubt that Putin has changed his perspective. I'll give you a great example. We talk about Putin as if he's a totalitarian. Russia is an authoritarian state. I don't think it's totalitarian. And that may be down to quibbling over what the difference between those two things are. But I do think there has been a shift from Putin of the early days, which was very pro-European, specifically pro-German, very inclined to accommodate the West. I don't think you can put it to a specific point. I think ultimately it's because we screwed him over. over and over and over again. But
we're not talking about the screw-over point. We're talking about the point where the media changed.
Yeah.
And when he realised that he didn't control the media, he had the transition to, now the media will never not be under my control.
Yeah. Well, so they did try this at the beginning. You remember they took away all the phones from the Russian soldiers that went in. Well, Telegram, for example, is awash with footage that's liberated because they can't control it. You can't control it indefinitely. You will get tons and tons of footage of what's going on. You also get lots of independent journalists who are on the ground.
Russian journalists?
No, Westerners. Independent Westerners. This is the important thing. Occasionally you get a European, particularly French journalist who will go and he'll say the truth and then promptly get told by Paris to come home and keep quiet. But a lot of it is people who've like Peter Lancaster, who isn't really a journalist, he was traveling, he found Donetsk, he decided to stay in Donetsk, and then he films what's happening. And there's no commentary, it's live footage. You get lots and lots of drone footage of battlefields. Some of it's truly harrowing, field upon field of dead Ukrainian soldiers. But the objective reality is Putin hasn't gone to a war footing. He's still using a peacetime army. So the idea that he hasn't got reserves when he's just doing what is effectively a policing action, the idea that he can be stopped, that he can't go up a level, is nonsense. And the casualty rates that the Europeans are talking about doesn't match the way you can see the fighting going on. The Russians aren't, except when they go into a town, they're not losing people. And the people who are going into the town are usually the militias or the Chechens. So the Russian army proper isn't losing huge numbers of people. And the Ukrainians have admitted to 200 dead and up to 1,000 injured a day. And they're probably lowballing it.
I want to take up this notion that for Russia, this is a policing action.
Why would you police with the trash?
Well,
why would you use the trash conscript army to take back the best wheat land, the best industrialized areas in the former empire?
But not only that, destroy them. I mean, like totally destroy them. The thing that always comes to me, irrespective of what you may be saying, Rhoderick, in terms of, Putin and Russia's overall plan, at the end of this war, someone is going to have to pick up the tab for the wreckage in the area that Russia wanted from Ukraine. Now, it's not going to be the West. And obviously, Russia being under international sanctions, which are starting to bite as we're speaking. I mean, they didn't bite initially when we put them on because, of course, it takes time for sanctions to bite. But, the Russian economy, I don't think, is going to be in a very good state in terms of trying to reconstruct the area that they coveted with, wanton brutality and force. You've got cities that are destroyed. You've got farming land that's mined. Who the hell's going to bloody do anything with that?
Okay, well, let's go down the list. Number one, Grozny is now one of the best built cities in the Russian sphere.
Russian oil from the early period.
Yeah. The Russians
export.
Have experience of rebuilding cities, and they make it profitable. Right. So, yes, there is a lot of damage that needs to be fixed. They will make a lot of money fixing it. And frankly, for a lot of those which were increasingly being deindustrialized by the Ukrainians, a lot of these cities are going to end up aesthetically better than they were before. That's not a justification for doing it. That's just a statement of where the end point will be. Demining, that's going to be a hard job. The Russians are very good at it. I mean, my own benighted homeland is also very good at it. You can be a poor country and be really good at demining. So I don't think that's a grand issue.
Just to jump in, the next thing on the list. See, I agree with you that the cities aren't a problem because Putin doesn't want them. Because the lesson from Grozny is exactly what you've said. The way you buy a population is give young guys something to do. And rebuilding the city and paying them well works brilliantly. And the numbers yesterday from the Russian journalist who auctioned his Nobel medal was that 15.3 million Ukrainians already aren't in their homes, are dislocated. Yeah, that was the number yesterday, the official number. In another 2 weeks, it will be half of Ukraine will be dislocated. So what it means is this is the ultimate transmigration opportunity to move millions of people from the unstable, difficult, unreliable, unproductive bits of Siberia to essentially paradise in comparison. Let them build new cities, reconstruct an economy. So the one thing I'll agree with you on is the systematic destruction of cities is deliberate and poses absolutely no problems for the Russian plan. It is the plan. And the plan will get exactly what they want.
The grand question about the economy, I'm not seeing what people are seeing. I mean, the fact that the ruble is now they're genuinely having a danger of de-inflation, and that the ruble is potentially too high, as opposed to rubble as it was promised by the West. I think it's going to be slow, it's going to be painful, but I don't think in any way what has happened economically to the Russians is existential to their economy. In fact, I don't even think let's keep in mind, inflation is really problematic for the people at the bottom end of the socioeconomic ladder when it hits fuel and food. And what does Russia produce that won't be affected by inflation? Fuel and food. There will be problems with the high-tech stuff, but a lot of the high-tech stuff is made in China under European or American labels, while the Chinese will sell it without the label.
Yeah, parallel importing has already begun. So what we're already seeing is that with tech stuff, it's either coming in with the brand taken off, or it's coming in from an intermediate country who are assuming they'll get a really good deal later on oil and wheat when external trade is available again. So again, there is no economic problem here. From a Russian perspective, this is not an economic problem. They have no problem torturing their people in the short term. And in the long term, transmigration, rebuilding cities, and parallel importing will solve the economic problem. The actual war is the only really thing that is of interest, because the Russian system, by its very nature, will put people through the hamburger mincer and make new patties at the other end. There's no problem with that.
Yeah, the question for the war, earlier you raised about the conscripts. It was apparently the case that Putin ordered that no conscripts should be used. And a lot of generals found they had no choice. They needed the conscripts for drivers. I'm under the impression, I don't know definitively, it's second, third, fourth hand, that this has been dealt with. I don't know, but that seems to have been the case. That the fighting men weren't conscripts, but the guys driving the stuff, particularly the lorries, they were conscripts. And they were also using the kind of material that conscripts end up being dumped with, trucks that don't work and tires that should have been replaced 6 years ago, that kind of stuff. A lot of the stuff that the West gloated about. But I'm under the impression that's largely dealt with.
Yeah, the interesting question there is Wagner Group were essentially brought back from Northern Africa. So the French had handed over to Wagner Group all over North Africa because they were sick of the body count. They'd learnt the lesson. Wagner Group have now been withdrawn from North Africa to Ukraine. Now, is that because they want people who are already stone cold and nasty? Probably yes. The question is, did they need them for manpower, or did they need them because they're stone cold and nasty? And that's the bit I can't find an answer to.
My guess is that's for going into the western part of Ukraine,
and nasty. Yeah.
Where they don't care about survivors. Because, let's be brutally honest, the Russians want the old Russian part of Ukraine to be part of Russia. They want the Ukraine to be independent and allied to Russia. And they want to burn down Western Ukraine. Now, at the beginning of the war, I thought they would give it to the West and let us deal with the problem. But I think after the palaver that happened with the Poles trying to basically slowly wiggle their way into the West, I don't see the Russians being able. I don't see Putin being able to resist the pressure to go to Lviv, burn it down, and salt the land.
Yeah, okay. That's assuming that the push to the West goes that well. Let's assume at the moment we got two fronts. things are moving slow and steady on the destroy the east. The reason they haven't taken those cities yet is because the artillery is being used to make sure there's no cities left, so no one can come back. The Ukrainians are pretending they're battling for cities. In reality, they're just watching the systematic destruction, and if they've got any brains, they'll get it out of the way. But the second front is what's happening in the port cities. Because fundamentally, if it ends up being a rump state with no port cities and the east gone, then it is just a zombie kill zone between Poland and the Dnieper. And again, that's probably acceptable. But if the Ukrainians can manage to get the port cities back, then at least anything they can grow in Western Ukraine, they can trade out of ports. So
yeah, but they're not going to get.
No, but that's the interesting thing at the moment. We're getting lots of waffle from both sides about the battle for Donbass, and nowhere near enough waffle about the battle for the port cities, when that is actually the battle that matters.
My understanding is that apart from Odessa, the others are all resolved, and Odessa is basically going to be surrounded, but Odessa means too much. Plus, Odessa's got like 90% Russian or Russian Greek population. They'd rather the city kick the Ukrainians out. And I don't know. I mean, if the Ukrainians in Odessa are completely surrounded, do they want to face the same fate as the Azov Brigade?
But then this is the interesting question. Where's all the Western kit going? Because, okay, we've got to expect a two-phase strategy. You've got to train people to use the kit and then train people to train the trainers. Sorry, other way around. Train trainers and then train people to use the kit. So in reality, we're not going to see most Western heavy artillery in use until at least the middle of July. So the real test is in the middle of July. Is there any point in being in front of the meat grinder that is taking the Donbass, or is the battle for a coastline which is at least useful? So the fact that the Ukrainians are still pissing about trying to get Snake Island back suggests that if the coastline is completely worthless, throwing away a special forces detachment that is irreplaceable on Snake Island is loony. So we have to wonder, are the Ukrainians loony? The one thing I'd say so far is they may not be winning, but they're not loony.
Okay, so Rhoderick, I mean, in terms of how the Ukrainians are prosecuting the war, one thing that did occur to me over the last week or so is that the big three in Western Europe seem to be going cold on Zelensky and Ukraine. I think that they are deliberately slowing the supply of munitions and heavy weapons. But not only that, I mean, a colleague of mine in the UK was saying to me just last night that, how many in-laws do the Ukrainians think are in stocks ready to be sent off to Ukraine? We're starting to run low on weapons because of our own peculiar procurement processes, which are neither effective nor efficient, but they do produce very good stuff, only in very small quantities that are extraordinarily expensive, and they're very hard to reproduce. So, do you think that there is this Western pressure from Rome, Berlin, and Paris that we're going to start seeing play on Zelensky over the next few weeks, for instance? Well,
the first thing is to say Berlin's a bit wet on that. This seems to be coming from Mario Draghi. Draghi, he's not really the leader of Italy. He's the EU's Gauleiter in Europe, in Italy. Yeah. He's an appointee in all but name. And he doesn't represent Italy. He represents the EU, but he's also not stupid. And he seems to have been the first of the European leaders to go, well, apart from Orban, he's the first of the EU leaders to go, this is a mistake, we need to end it now. And considering Italy's reputation for throwing leaders out of buildings, there's good reason to learn not to do that. Macron seems to have also come round to this. I think that's got a lot to do with whatever happened in the Azovstal, which we may not know the details for years now. But in terms of Germany, it is true the German economy is panicking, but the German government is made up of the left, the equivalent of the Labour Party, and the Greens are fanatics. So Scholz can't be enthusiastic for peace because the Greens will crash his government. I'm not sure Scholz will be Chancellor at the end of the year, personally.
Don't we love the irony of that the Greens are the warmongers in this setting?
Yes. But except it's not irony. I mean, if you've known anything about the Green parties of the West, particularly the Germans for ages, they're rabidly anti-Atlanticist in Germany in particular, but they're fantasists, and they have no care for human life. They have no qualms about pursuing policies that will lead to genocide. I mean, some of them are not smart enough to know it will be genocide. Others just don't care. But at any rate, in terms of the weapons, one of the smaller reasons why there's a slowdown is because the Ukrainians are saying these weapons don't work. And if you're an arms factory in America, do you want the reputation that your what do you call them, javelins bounce off of tanks? My understanding is the javelins are poor. The Stingers have always been poor. The Panzerfaust 3s are poor, and the NLAWs are okay if you hit the flank, but hitting anything else than the flank is just bouncing off. And most of the tank kills we've seen have been artillery.
And that's the historical data. The way you kill tanks is to bury them in heavy rain. Yeah.
The Russians have proved, as they did 100 years ago, as they did 200 years ago, artillery is still queen of the battle. And none of us, apart from the Russians, have anything like enough artillery pieces. There isn't enough NATO artillery to defend Ukraine. I'm not sure there's enough NATO artillery to defend Poland or Germany.
So how do the Americans sort of fit in all of this then, Rhoderick? I mean, we're talking about great powers. We've now spoken about the European powers and where they sit. But of course, the biggest elephant in the room is the United States and the Biden administration. It has committed itself to the defense of Ukraine, but it won't be able to do that if the European partners are going cold on the idea, whether in part or in whole. So whatever the result that Zelensky wants for himself and his country is going to have to be subpar just from that situation alone, right?
Yeah, but from the American perspective, we need to remember that last year they walked out of Kabul.
Well,
so the lesson in the Biden regime is don't believe anything they say because it's not worth a pinch of salt.
Keep in mind a military difference between the Americans and the Russians, which I think overplays everything. The American military is designed to play everywhere. It means they have lots of equipment that's specific for areas, but very little that's sort of go everywhere, do everything. They have huge diversity. The Russians have very, very focused military spending. They spend on what they need. They spend cheap. They build en masse. The Russians have more stuff, and their stuff works, and it's designed for fighting where they're going to fight. The Russians don't have jungle warfare equipment. They don't have desert war equipment. They don't need to be worrying about, putting troops in Congo. The Americans have to worry about putting troops anywhere, everywhere. And this creates a disparity. The Americans have an amazingly complicated toolbox full of tools that do one thing, and one thing only in a specific sense. The Russians have a handful of hammers and spanners, and those hammers and spanners work all the time, and they do the job.
The hammers and spanners also have a global footprint, which is something that we tend not to sort of concentrate on because now all efforts are focused on Ukraine. But, currently the Russians are apparently deploying forces to Nicaragua. They have had forces in situ in Venezuela. They've been involved in Mali. They're in Libya and Syria. So, do the tools that the Russians have, are they complementary for the task that is needed for them as they move further afield from Mother Russia into areas that are far removed from it in terms of geographic space? And can they sustain those operations at the same time as they are embroiled in this war in Ukraine?
I think we should go down the list. The first one, Nicaragua. It seems to me the Nicaraguans are trolling the Americans. I would be surprised if there's any more than 4 or 5 guys. The Venezuela stuff, I'm under the impression it's highly specific experts. It's people with technical background, and that they happen to wear uniforms, but they're probably much more connected to logistics and the fuel industry than actual soldiers. And then there might be a few bodyguards and stuff like that. But the general impression is it's professionals doing a professional job. And there's not very many of them. The African stuff is much more interesting. And I'm an Africa, I wouldn't say specialist, but that's my area. And I am struggling to find reliable information. I find plenty of clearly unreliable information about what's going on. I have seen one photo of a whole bunch of Malians walking around with Russian flags saying, "Get the French out." And I was like, does that really make sense? We used to say this about Arab mobs, that they were only allowed to protest what they were allowed to protest against. And they were allowed to protest against Israel. That's why they always protest against Israel. Large parts of Africa are like that. That being said, the French in particular have badly managed their post-colonial period, in that they've tried to stay in places that weren't worth staying in, and they've done it heavy-handedly because they've relied on the Legion, and the Legion's expendable. So they've been willing to do messier things than say the Brits. I'm not for European powers leaving Africa, but I am for them doing whatever they do in Africa in a little bit more informed way. And the French have not been doing that for a while. And a lot of that's to do with the internal dynamics of the French military and the French military's relationship with the presidency. And it's complicated and convoluted. But essentially, it looks like an attempt to push the French out and replace them with Russians. I can't see it going much further. The advantage of it is this: the Chinese offend a lot of people's sensibilities in Africa. And maybe that's more true in Southern Africa, in my own benighted homeland, in Zambia, in Mozambique, in Botswana, although, I mean, Botswana's rich, so they can afford a bit of comeback. But the Chinese they ruffle people's feathers in ways that the Russians seem not to. I would struggle to imagine that this is going to be large footprint kind of stuff. Yeah, there might be Wagner stuff for really messy stuff, but that's going to be contract. That's going to be in for 6 months, as much wet work as possible, and then out. They're not going to have permanent bases. They're not going to do their PT in front of the presidential palace every morning, as they did in Gabon, like as a Legion d'étrangers did in Gabon.
This raises an interesting question, though, because part of the history of the Soviet Union is military advisors going to places with a lot of good knowledge and making a big impact. So historically, how many militaries across Latin America and Africa actually have good memories of really helpful Russian advisors?
Well, in the case of the Africans, it will be, of the, say, 56 of them, I would say at least 30, maybe 40. There's big standout exceptions, like Zimbabwe, where we were basically, our armies were trained by the North Koreans, the Cubans, and the Chinese. But in most places, you've had really good Russian advisors or really, really dodgy European and American advisors.
So the interesting thing with this is it raises that issue that Wagner Group going into North Africa may have been something that Macron was totally happy about, because it was a way to do the wet work without it being on French hands, get the blood on someone else's hands. And it's an indication of why Macron was more than happy to be the one interacting with Putin, because he's the one who's realized the greatest utility of Putin. Rather than seeing a boogeyman, he sees the utility, which raises all sorts of interesting questions for once the European position falls to pieces.
But the French position on Russia is coloured by the long association between Paris and Moscow, irrespective of who was in charge in both countries. I mean, they go back hundreds of years in terms of diplomatic, niceties.
But Macron is a banker and a pragmatist. And Putin's got a PhD in neoliberal economics. We've got two dudes who sit at the table and drink the same Kool-Aid on how to rebuild the world economically. And Macron's kind of jack of how French politics runs, and Putin's jack of Russia failure.
So is there a form of collusion taking place between Paris and Moscow where the center does not hold because there is no real German military center holding Europe together, but you've got like a consortium of military interests both on the French side and on the Russian side. And if they manage to, I don't know, silently cooperate on areas of mutual interest, somehow between the two, they are going to have undue influence on how the inner workings of Europe progress.
We just described why Germany can't change direction.
Yeah.
France can.
Yeah.
And if France changes direction, how will the EU hold its line? The French don't have good access to oil.
Yeah.
So yes, they can run nuclear power for all sorts of things, but it's going to be another 20 years before they can use all that power to run electric vehicles and electric everything. Electrification is a very slow, very expensive project.
It is.
And the French want it, but they're nowhere near it.
Yeah.
Sorry, Rhoderick.
Everything you said makes perfect sense. And if I were in either of those men's positions, that's what would be happening. And there may be an element of that happening, but I think we have run the risk of overstating it. This is probably a marginal thing. Macron is very deep in the EU system, and he's very deep in the world economic system. Now, to be fair, he's clearly the smartest of the lot. He is clearly a pragmatist, and I think of all the big WEF people, he's probably the first one out the door when
it goes wrong. Yeah.
Basically, when it starts ending up looking like guillotines, which it might literally do. Because these people have, for lack of a better word, they have ballsed it up. The thing for Germany ultimately is it cannot be saved as long as the Greens are in power. And it needs...
We've had Merkel for decades, who also didn't do anything constructive. So the wonderful thing is the German political elite has become so dysfunctional and incompetent that everyone's just got to go around it. Until which side?
And the interesting thing about this is that, we speak, or Rhoderick made mention, about the EU, it has a French core because France basically exported most of its best people into the EU with the specific role to run and administer the European continent, for crying out loud, and so therefore those poor buggers who are in Paris and in France generally in the outlying areas are suffering the sting and arrow of having a suboptimal class of people running them when all the better people went off to Brussels to milk the gravy train over there. But historically speaking, when Germany is weak, France is strong, and arguably in that sort of strategic dynamic, it does make sense for them to reach out across to Putin to see what can be done and find some form of accommodation. I mean, I know it sounds awful for me to say this publicly, but it has to be said because there are historical drivers in this that seem pretty obvious when you give voice to them, right?
There are two big muddling things, though, to keep in mind. The first is a shared currency, and the second is the existence of the European, not the bureaucracy, but its sort of executive heads, people like Ursula von der Leyen, some people call her Ursula von der Crazy, and Borrell and them. Now, these people, they think they're entitled to govern Europe. There's a big push at the moment for a Eurobond system, basically to try and save everything. They've wanted a Eurobond forever, and the way the European economies have not dealt well with the reduction of Russian fuel is giving them an opportunity. But I don't know how much France can liberate itself from both the euro and from the European oligarchy. Yes, 19th century politics, a Franco-British-Russian alliance against Germany is natural and normal, and that's where we should be heading. And Turkey should be in the mix as well. I think the really interesting thing about the whole process is the madness of Britain. Boris has been really good on every policy in the first instance, going back, COVID, everything, and then he gets nobbled and he becomes a fanatic for the wrong ideas. And he is very, very fanatical about the war. He went straight to Kiev after Draghi and Macron and Scholz and I think the Romanian leader, but I could be wrong about the Romanian leader.
Yeah.
And basically went to undo whatever they did. He's pursuing it with a zealotry which is completely bonkers.
Well, would it? Sorry, David. I mean, the Partygate would have to have a major impact on the way that Boris Johnson's handling his situation with Ukraine. I mean, if he can come across as a Churchillian leader, backing another Churchillian leader, it's only going to give him, manna from heaven in terms of political good graces. Especially with the British public that are, well, I would imagine a lot of them are quite jack of him, quite frankly.
I don't think he's doing this because the comms people told him to. He is so Churchillian, and he is so desperate to be Churchill Jr.
Yes,
and if the only way he can get it is to hang out with Vladimir. That is totally legit.
Yeah.
There is another factor, which is that the Americans have us by the short and curlies, particularly Pelosi. She won't let a proper trade deal, a post-Brexit trade deal, go through unless he jumps when she says jump. That's a big part of our response to COVID. We had the right policies. We were going to go down the route of Sweden. And then suddenly it was, I thought it was initially because he got sick, but the more I look at it, it looks like the Americans said, no, you will do as we do. We do not want a counterexample. So I don't know. I think it's something deeper. I think they have something personally on him. Before he became foreign secretary, he was very pro the common sense thing, which is make friends with Russia so as we can pull it away from China. Apparently, he had a meeting with some spooks and he came out of the meeting and he was completely the reverse. Now, someone like him doesn't change his mind just because he's told to change it. They have to have something on him. And you consider the dirt that he goes through and doesn't fall. By the way, I think Partygate is overblown. There's a lot of people who are pissed off because they missed funerals and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, when you reasonably look at it, Partygate's not that much. And most of the people who hate him for Partygate hated him already, and they'll hate him if there was no Partygate. So it doesn't really matter for his politics, for his electoral advantages.
Yeah. And the reality is that after Partygate, Keir Starmer's numbers are worse, not better.
Well, that's right.
The reality is the Bojo doesn't matter if he's loathed. He feels he has the right to rule, and there's not a better option. So he may as well get on with it.
Sounds awfully aristocratic to me.
Well, that's exactly what it is.
That fundamentally is the problem. There are no alternatives to Boris that are improvements.
There's a T-shirt, no alternatives to Boris.
What about this notion of a fair world order coming out of all of this? I mean, the war continues for however long it continues. And say, for instance, it goes to the end of the year or bleeds into next year. There are a number of countries that are going to be very concerned with regard to food and energy security. I mean, we're looking in the Middle East at the moment of Egypt being the torchbearer of another Arab revolt, a major one, something even worse than what happened during the Arab uprising. So where do we stand in terms of getting to see food and energy security returning back to normal? Is there such a time?
Fair world order is essentially Putin's attempt to manage a multipolar world. It's also a rebuke against the way the Americans have mismanaged the unipolar moment. I have no problem with it in principle. I think we're going to have no problem. We're going to have to live with it. It is going to be the world order. I suspect the Chinese will come out second best. I would much rather a world ordered along Putin's idea of what's fair as opposed to Xi's idea of what he's entitled to, or Biden's, whatever whim that pops into his head or his minder's head. I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's probably the least worst outcome for the world. food, the Russians have committed to save Africa from a food crisis. Whether they can or can't, I don't know, but I think they're gonna pull out every attempt to do it. They have every incentive to do it. But there are massive food problems coming along the way, which have got nothing to do with the war. And then there are even bigger ones which have got to do exactly with the war. Fertilizer. And we had this conversation at the beginning. Albanese should have said fertilizer in his first conversation. Very first sentence should be, we're going to start making fertilizer. We're going to make the world's fertilizer. We're going to make the best fertilizer in the world. But then he would have sounded like Trump. I'm very worried about what the Americans might do to prevent a fair world order happening. Very worried about Taiwan. In our first conversation, I thought the Chinese would make a play for Taiwan because demographics is against them and the clock is ticking, and you want to get in before Biden's replaced, presumably by Harris or by Trump. Now it looks like the Americans might try and force the Chinese to make a play for Taiwan. And some Americans are talking about being able to win a nuclear war.
Yeah, but the Russians have been talking about that for 20 years.
Yeah.
They're just catching up on the psycho.
Yeah, but they're talking now. That's the problem. The problem is not that the conversation happened, in the context of some theoretical planner in a conference somewhere. The point is that some gimp had got up and said, we can win a nuclear war with China. And that's truly terrifying. And I don't know what madness the Biden administration will do in order to try and save itself before the midterms.
Here's a question for you, Rhoderick. I mean, in terms of Chinese food and energy security, China may own Africa in a kind of way because they've gone there and they've planted their flag all over the place, and they've, gifted various African leaders with all kinds of lovely little things. But in the end, they have no real capacity to hold on to what they've got. They are not an imperial power per se. We tend to overestimate the Chinese military. The Chinese military's key role, I would say its principal role, is to suppress the Chinese people. It is not to go fighting wars or planting flags in far-off continents. So if Chinese interests in Africa were to be challenged by anyone, whether it be the French, the Americans, God help me, I don't know, the Europeans collectively, whatever, I think they're going to be in for a bit of a struggle. Their navy has not been able to really penetrate into the Indian Ocean. A lot of their ships, while they've been cranking them out in an order of magnitude, they've just pushed out their first domestically produced nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. I mean, to me, it looks like a lot of floating targets, and maybe we shouldn't really be so worried about what the Chinese are going to be doing. The other thing that we have to worry about, too, is that, the Chinese don't have demographics on their side as well. I mean, their population is aging. They have a serious gender imbalance within the country. And since the one-child policy has prevented multiple children per family, I don't know whether or not Chinese parents want to sacrifice their little emperors for the greater good of the CCP on far-flung overseas missions. I'm just putting a whole bunch of things in front of you. Sorry for that, but
No.
Well, what are your thoughts?
So yeah, my view on the Chinese. The Chinese don't need armies to retain their access to Africa. They need to bribe leaders. The only people who would be able to send troops to Africa to overthrow African governments or kick the Chinese out, but we'd have to do it by overthrowing the governments, are Britain, France, America, and possibly Australia, because you have capacity, but you're far away. But you do have capacity. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, apart from the Americans doing something stupid, it doesn't make sense for us to go in and try and kick the Chinese out. It's all cost and no benefit. I do see African populations, and Zambia and Zimbabwe are big potential cases for this, but I'm under the impression that that's pretty much across the board. I can see African populations turning around and saying, right, Chinese out now. And it could start in a little village. It could basically be, I know about various instances like that. They're out in a mining village. The Chinese guy is having his way with one of the local women,
Local girls.
and he slaps her out about a bit because he's a bit drunk. She goes to her brother, and he comes back with a big stick and beats the living daylights out of the Chinese guy and puts him in hospital.
Yep.
And the government cracks down on the guy, and the people rise up to defend the guy. Stuff like that happens.
Mm-hmm.
It's happening increasingly, and one day it's going to happen properly. There's a role for Russia. Nobody hates the Russians. If the Russians are the guys standing in between, it might protect the Chinese interests. The demographic stuff, everybody's screwed with demographics apart from Africa and India and Indonesia. So, yes, the Chinese are in a bad way demographically. All of Europe, with the possible exception of Britain, is in a bad way demographically. And Britain only because we can import our way out of it. Everyone in South America is in a demographics crisis. The Middle East is in a demographics crisis. The Americans have been able to moderate it through immigration, but moderated it. I mean, they're not much further down the road than everyone else. The key with the demographics, I think, is where you get to the other end. The Japanese will be out of the tunnel first. Does that make Japan super dangerous?
No.
Yes.
No.
No. Who knows?
No. Because quite simply, even the young people don't want to have sex and don't go outside. So the idea that generates a dangerous state, whereas the US out the other end is still mean and nasty.
My caveat with the Japanese is when the economy collapses, which it looked like it was going to do last month, when the bottom fell out of their bonds, and people are literally starving in the streets, that makes you mean and nasty again.
But they're old and nasty. So.
Yeah, but the old will die.
They move to the countryside to retire.
and die on the burst. No.
Yeah.
Again, it's a question of who wants to inherit Japan, and that will be an interesting invasion in 50 years' time.
We'll be dead before it's an issue.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
That one will be interesting. But again, this is the fascinating thing with the Ukrainians. If essentially we are at 20 million people by next week dislocated, we're starting to get the reports of the level of defection from the Ukrainian army. People go off on recuperation leave, hand in the helmet and the weapon, and just keep walking west. And there's no rule that says they can't leave Ukraine. They're just not allowed to come back. But it's quite clear the guys who are leaving already are going, my family is somewhere nice. It's going well. The Europeans have a shortage of young people who believe in life and the future.
There's a couple caveats to that, though.
All right. Give me
the first caveat is a huge chunk of those aren't going west, they're going east. And I know the Ukrainians say they're being forced to go there, but they're not. And some of them will come back, some of them will stay in Russia. And considering some of them will come back to places that will become part of Russia, I think that's a distinction without a difference.
Some of them will go to Siberia.
Yeah, but to me, the more interesting group are the ones going west, because Europe is going to get a population that believe in the future when they've long since stopped having one. Russia desperately needs anyone it can get and needs to be grateful for the fact that the average Ukrainian family still has 3 kids. The average Russian family has 1.2 kids.
How many of these coming to Europe are going to share the ideas that's kicked this all off? The Banderite worldview.
Yeah. You think we're back to the Nazi thing? I just think Europeans are going to get white Christians who have 3 kids and don't mind working in factories and on farms.
Yeah.
So Europe becomes, we're talking about what kind of different animal places become. Europe is about to get white Christian people who want to have kids and work hard, and is going to unleash its racism going, and now we don't need 1 million Syrians and Afghanis. This is going to be ugly.
Yeah, I see that happen for sure.
Yes. I mean, there's a general trend everywhere that's got the demographics problem in the West, that it's progressive people not having kids, and Christians and ultra-nationalists, that second group, particularly in Europe, who are breeding. And, moderates like us with a handful of kids, we're just sort of sitting in the middle. We're not the problem, we're not the solution. But what happens when you're 1.5, 2.5 nice, moderate, middle-class kids are outnumbered by 6 Christian fanatics, which is likely to happen in America.
The Ukrainians are going to find a home where they're so welcome. From what I hear from friends in Germany and Spain and France, the Ukrainians are being welcomed because they're bringing life back to dying villages.
I'm getting the impression they're not welcome in the south, that you're getting places where supermarkets will say no Ukrainians are allowed.
That's wild. But then the Mediterranean is, again, Europe often wants to draw a line in the sand with Italy and Spain. But the whole point is the demographic crisis is going to be transformed by mass migration of what comes out of this. So, the Chinese bought all of last year's food. They're going to eat this year's food this year. And there won't be any food planted this year in so many places. So next year, the hunger starts.
Yes, for everyone.
The game is on next year in terms of starvation for everyone. And that really is the game changer. Because, of course, the Russian population won't starve. The Ukrainian population, that will be the final straw. The Europeans will have to work out who they can buy from. The Canadians will rub their hands together because they will be allowed to buy American fertilizer. Australia will miss the massive opportunity to feed Indonesia and finally, peaceful down the neighborhood. And what does China do potentially when 400 people in the north are hungry? So really, the irony of this year is that this year is not the year that matters. This is the year that's creating the problems. Yeah. Next year is the year where the problems will all come home to roost.
I'm truly dreading next year.
Yeah. Next year is genuinely scary because people lose the reasons not to arc up.
I think, gentlemen, that this is a really good time to wrap up. I'm getting depressed. All right. So 2023, bad year. What we can do is probably pack up stumps from the city, move into the countryside and grow vegetables like mad.
And put barbed wire around it for all the numpties who didn't.
Our governments have disarmed us, so I don't know how we're going to defend ourselves. But
that's why I said barbed wire, or you can use as obstacles.
David has a lot of knives.
Yes, he does. Yes, he does. Yeah.
They're not getting put on the fence. No.
No.
Well, everyone, that's a wrap. My thanks to returning guest Rhoderick Miller, co-host David Olney, and producer Michael Migali for being with us today, and our thanks to the Ozcast Network. To our audience, thanks for listening. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to the audio version of Strategicon through the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify, and please like us on the Sage International Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. You can also watch our podcasts on video through the Strategicon Raw YouTube channel when they are available, easily accessed by clicking on the link provided on our website. Until next time, it's goodbye from me, John Bruni. You've been listening to Strategicon, a Sage International podcast.
Ozcast. Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.